Hello, dear friends. Monday, March the 11th, 2024. Beautiful, beautiful weather out today. About 5 degrees Celsius, but it feels a lot warmer because the sun is shining. How are you doing? I hope you're doing well. We are finished. We have finally finished the book on Canadian corruption by Peter C. Newman, covering 1985 to 1995. And let's just quickly go through the last 4 chapters. And I was pleasantly surprised at how the book ended because it confirmed some of the suspicions that I had, and I will share those with you very, very soon. There's not a lot to tell you about it. Chapter 12 is about, we covered chapter 12, didn't we, right? That was the one, Goodbye Charlie Brown, where the kind of end of Mulroney. Chapter 13, Rebellion West, is the title of the chapter. This is talking about Western Canada and some of the characteristics that Peter C. Newman saw there. If he was a painter, he'd be trying to paint a picture of Canada. I guess he'd be like an impressionist painter, but with the brush strokes would be a little bit too fuzzy. You know, he's trying his best, but he makes these broad sweeping generalizations about Canada and about Canadians, and sometimes they hit and sometimes they miss, but you know, God rest his soul, he tried his best. Yeah, so he's talking about all the West and their concerns and their relationships to Mulroney, and he mentions the Protestant ethic. I've talked about that before. BC's provincial governments. He said here on page 375, the province was different. He's talking about British Columbia, because everything was so polarized with little sense of Canadian moderation or compromise. The trait was best illustrated by BC's provincial governments, which alternated more sharply from far left to distant right than any other administration in the country. Even religious observances were subject to the provincial bent for acrimony. When the government installed a prayer room in the provincial legislature, it was immediately taken over by a coven of local witches, a Satanist, and a couple of garden variety Victoria pagans. And he's painting a picture of the extremes of the politics of British Columbia and how it's kind of always been a little bit more out there. It's kind of Canada's version of California, where the disgruntled and the, let's just say, the more colorful characters of Canadian society would gravitate towards. They would, you know, you can't keep going west after you hit BC. That's it. You hit the ocean, right? And so that little anecdote I thought was insightful on maybe the kind of left-leaning slant. He says they've vacillated between left and right, which is not true. It's the most left province of the country of Canada by a long shot. Anyway, he talks about the Reform Party, and it's interesting. He does a blurb on the Reform Party, and that was a party created Preston Manning, and he talks about it as a populist movement and how dangerous populism. He makes a statement on page 381. Populism is always angry, often negative, and never friendly to the status quo. So, populism is just essentially, what grabs the attention of the population, right? The people are interested in something and it gains ground, and it's kind of an organic movement, but it's seen as scary and they try to paint that as something very dangerous, right? Sure, it's dangerous to the status quo, because if you piss off enough people long enough, they're going to organize themselves and they'll create their own political party, which is kind of what the Reform Party was, right? That would never gain traction today because it would be immediately labeled as far-right Christian nationalist or something like that, and it would be it would just be it would be attacked from all different directions. but it gained a lot of sway under Preston Manning. Preston Manning was perfectly cast, this is from page 382, was perfectly cast as Reform's founding leader. He was not a great orator, nor an impressive stage presence, but he had that Bible thumper's perfect cadence that made God seem to bear witness to his message. It's kind of funny. He was a member of the Alliance Church of Canada. Some of the comments that Newman makes about Manning is funny. The Alliance Church, right, is so, he's talking about the characteristics of the church. It's been said that in jest, its adherents, the members of the Alliance Church, would not make love while standing in case the Lord thought they were dancing. That's funny. So he throws in some good humor here and there, talking about the West and the Reform Party, Preston Manning, and that finishes off chapter 13. So chapter 13, he calls it Rebellion West. There was no rebellion of the West. I mean, there's always been grumblings of, oh, we could survive on our own. Alberta has always said that because they have so much resources and they contribute so much to the Canadian economy, but nothing's ever come of it. And so he gives a blurb on the West and he gives a blurb on the Reform Party in chapter 13. Chapter 14 called Rebellion East, and we have here talking about the rise of the Bloc Quebecois, and we have a lot of coverage on Lucien Bochard, right? He talks about, and this is quite insightful chapter because Lucien Bochard was a longtime friend of Brian Mulroney, and then he stabbed him in the back on the Meech Lake Accord. He had no loyalty. He says about he's talking about another political guy. This is Bochard talking. I have great admiration and affection for him to the extent that one can have affection for others in politics. In other words, Bochard considered that in politics, it's every man for himself, even though he wouldn't have had a career had it not been for Mulroney. And then he ends up stabbing him in the back by sabotaging the Meech Lake Accord. He left his wife, he had a mistress, he married another woman. It's kind of, I don't know if it's political justice, but I don't know if you remember, the guy lost a leg. He had to get one of his legs amputated for some disease that he had. And I don't know if you call that poetic justice or political justice. He says that politics clearly is not made for tender hearts. So he was a bit of a hard nose. And chapter 14 gives a brief blurb on Lucien Bochard and doesn't put him in much of a light. It ends by saying, someone accusing him of being a traitor to the country. And Lucien Bochard replies, traitor? Traitor? Traitor to what? My country is Quebec. That was the sentiment of Lucien Bochard and where his loyalties lied, right? And I think it should have been obvious to the people around him, but anyway, he had Mulroney fooled. Chapter 15, Rebellion Red, the First Nations Triumphant. This is a short overview of the Indigenous peoples in Canada and their struggle to gain political seat at the table, so to speak. It's a very short chapter. It's only, from 425 to 4. It's only like less than 20 page chapter. So it's a very brief overview, and how much can you say about a topic that could deserve its own book, right? So there you go, talking a bit about that. Then the last chapter, chapter 16, Epitaph for the Two-Party State Election 1993. Here we get introduced to Kim Campbell, Jean Chretien, Jean Charest, a whole bunch of other characters on the Canadian political scene at that time. And the 1993 election, the New Democrats, right? They came into their own. Ed Broadbent and Audrey McLaughlin, who was also the leader after Ed Broadbent of the NDP party. So the kind of like the rise of the NDP, they're talking a bit about in the chapter. Again, a short chapter, just a blurb on the 1993 election. And then the epilogue, it kind of ends with a whimper It doesn't really say much. Just a few short pages on to try and sum things up, but it doesn't really say a whole heck of a lot. Again, trying to repeat the mantra of revolution. There was no revolution. It's just a stupid title for the book. One good thing is that it wasn't titled by the author. He places the blame on the title of the book for somebody else in his acknowledgments. But there's an interesting summation he does in the section on acknowledgments. He says, by the end of the decade, so by the end of 1995, very little could be taken on faith, or maybe he meant by the end of the 1990s. But in the paragraph previous, he's talking about the decade 85 to 95, and that, again, is what the book covers. So I'm assuming he's, again, talking about the end of 1995. By the end of the decade, very little could be taken on faith, since there was no longer any sustaining reservoir of trust to draw on. That precipitous decline of trust in most of the society's once sacrosanct touchstones is this book's essential subtext. That is the subtext of the book. The slow, gradual decay of trust, decay of trust between the electorate and the politicians, the decay of trust between the leaders of corporations and their employees, the decay of trust between churches and their members, just a gradual, slow, overall decay of trust. It could have been called the Canadian decay of trust. Oh, hello, Birdie. Somebody's calling me. Birdie's complaining too. So anyway, this shift in social values is what the book has been really talking about. And this is, I want to return to this where I said that the chapter on Mulroney was the biggest, longest, most tedious chapter. It was kind of like a mini autobiography. I don't know if you remember, I mentioned that in one of the previous videos covering the book. And that is really the main section that was like trying to read through Quicksand. Because, as he mentions here in the acknowledgement section, the kind of like the afterword of the book, he says, I decided to write this book instead of a Mulroney biography because I became convinced it was a much more urgent and interesting endeavor. Well, I don't know what his motivations were. I don't really care, but he had a reason. He originally wanted to write a biography about Brian Mulroney, and then he got sidetracked and says, well, I've got all this information that I've been writing. How can I incorporate this into something else? And so he slapped together a whole bunch of other stuff, all the corruption on the one end, and then Mulroney's biography in the middle, and then added on a few extra chapters at the end. And so you got this kind of hodgepodge of, Canadiana that kind of doesn't really go together all that well. But he went ahead and did it. Now here, this is very interesting, right? He says, it was important to get this down to Mulroney. He says, so he says, at the time, I heeded Philip Roth's warning that every biographer has two nightmares. One is that everybody gives out the same story. The other is that everybody gives you a different story. My initial probes made it clear that this would apply to a Mulroney book. Everyone, including its subject, seemed to have a hidden agenda. Had little to do with writing an authentic chronicle of the period. This was a long way from the Mulroney mood on February 15th, 1976, when we first discussed the possibility of me doing a book for him, should he become prime minister. So Peter C. Newman, a great writer, great editor of Maclean's, comes up to Mulroney in 1976 and says, hey, if you become prime minister, I could write your biography for you. He's done other biographies, right? And, of course, it's a win-win. He sells lots of books, and it makes Mulroney look good, and on and on. And he quotes him as saying, Mulroney says to Newman, I wouldn't want a puff job, he said at the time. As a modest student of history, I find myself so gosh darn frustrated. I'll leave out the expletive. Asking, what was the guy really like? So Mulroney turns to him and says, I don't want a puff job. Whenever I read biographies, he says, what was the guy really like? Did he look after his family? Did he swear? Did he get drunk? The the only Canadian Prime Minister who comes across as a human being is Sir John A. Macdonald. And if I were lucky enough to be in that position, I would not object at all to people reading about warts and failings, my warts and failings. They're all a part of me. And now this one sentence at the bottom of page 474, Peter C. Newman says, my, how things change. My, how things change. So this is what Mulroney told Newman prior to him making a biography on him. But then when Mulroney got into power, he wanted a puff piece. Right? He didn't want the warts and all. He didn't want to know people to know whether he drank or not, to whether he caroused or not, or anything about his failings, right? And Peter C. Newman, with that one sentence, lets us in on the entire effort that he made in these pages and pages on Mulroney. I forget what chapter it was. It just goes on. It's all about Mulroney. Half of the book is about Mulroney. And then he says, my, how things change. So Newman was not able to present a honest depiction of Mulroney. And if you read through the chapters on Mulroney, you can see how boring they are, how superficial they are, how he's complimenting him and picking out the most innocuous faults. Oh, he spent too much money on his wardrobe. Come on. You mean to tell me that was the most scandalous thing you found out about Mulroney while he was in power? And but anyway, that shows you that the author was completely frustrated. I'm sure this is not his best work. He would have been very disappointed at seeing this in print. God rest his soul. He's passed on now just last year. And I think if he were still around, he would agree that he was handcuffed in what he could write and what he couldn't write. That's just the nature of the game, right? Pardon me. So there you have it. That really confirmed my suspicions, and I'm very thankful that he actually included that single sentence. That single sentence on page 474 validates the efforts I put into reading this, superficial piece of Canadian memorabilia, if you want to call it that. And so then he goes into all these appendixes about meeting minutes, letters back and forth between a couple of different people. A lot of it is like Pink Floyd might say, a half a page of scribbled lines. A lot of it is just unnecessarily, copies of invoices and things that don't amount to anything. In fact, he even includes the invoice and payment of over $200,000 that Mulroney paid for the furnishings at 24 Sussex Drive, as if to validate himself, because he had come under scrutiny for getting Sussex Drive, refurnished at the taxpayer's expense. And he said, oh, no, I paid every penny of that. I paid that. So he actually includes that in the book to show that, oh, yeah, he paid for all his expenses. Can you imagine? The level of corruption that was covered in this time frame. I remember when Jean Chretien was caught giving somebody $4,000 or something in Quebec in a business deal, and it was like a huge scandal. So the level of corruption that has reached higher heights since this was published is a factor of 1,000, right? This is like the guys were doing nothing compared to what they're doing today, but they were still so concerned about making sure they come across as being, upright and following the letter of the law and so on and so forth. That's all gone out the window today. Today we're living in a complete kleptocracy where the politicians don't give a rat's whether they get caught or not. They just say, well, too bad. That's it. I'm the prime minister. I can do whatever I want, right? Anyway, and that's it. The appendix has a lot of unnecessary details thrown in about different meetings and different correspondence between different politicians. There is one interesting letter between Mulroney and Conrad Black, where Brian Mulroney sends Conrad Black a letter expressing his concerns about the passage of the Meech Lake Accord, which ended up getting torpedoed anyway. And Conrad Black writes back a week later and showing his superior intellect. That's to be expected. I mean, Conrad Black has got a mind like a friggin' alligator. The guy is a very powerful intellectual, you could say. And Conrad writes back and addresses his concerns and just it's interesting for like I said, a little bit of Canadiana memorabilia, if you want to call it that. And so there you have it. That's the book. It's a hodgepodge collection of trivia, tidbits, and superficial observations of the Canadian landscape between 85 and 95. The first half of the book is focused on the corruption amongst corporate leaders, bankers, and to a lesser extent politicians. And then the second half of the book is mostly about Brian Mulroney, because he was the prime minister for most of that portion of the decade. And then you got a few other pieces of trivia thrown in for good measure. So I do not recommend it unless you're a real student of politics and you really want to have a different opinion on Canadian politics at that time. If you lived through it, you can compare it to your own personal experience of that period. And if you haven't, it may give you a bit of insight on that decade. I don't know. I give it a 5 out of 10. It's just fucking waste of time. So I finally got through with that. I'm looking forward to this next book that was lent to me. This is called, okay, I'm going to wrap this up. Someone is asking for me. The next book I'm going to cover called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics. Imagine. So I'm excited to get into this. It looks like it's a short read. It's only, well, actually, no, it's 400 pages, but the text is a lot bigger. So yeah, this will be a short read. I should be able to get through this in a few days. And I'm looking forward to it because the guy's a psychologist and he's a real accomplished academic, blah, 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 a professor of psychology at Princeton and on, and New York Times bestseller, and a Nobel Prize winner at that, imagine. So this is going to be our next target, and I look forward to covering that for you. I think it'll be a good read, and we'll go from there. So thank you so much again for watching. God bless you. Have a great day. Hope you're able to get out and enjoy the weather, spend time with people you love, and find good books. Try not to waste your time on bad books. This wasn't a bad book, but it's just, it's one of those things. Sometimes you got to get through it. We'll talk to you again real soon. Have yourself a wonderful day. Thanks for watching. God bless you. Bye-bye now.